Thank you for watching this online class presentation from Cedarville University. Students from every major can use their God-given talent to honor Him in nearly 10 musical ensembles, both instrumental and chorale. Teams perform on campus, across the country, and around the world, giving all the glory to God. We invite you to learn more at cedarville.edu.
So Ezekiel is going to be really upset with me when I find him in heaven. My plan right now is to try to avoid him for several thousand years. But we don't have time to cover all of this book, and so I'm going to do it in two ways. Number one, I'm simply going to say Ezekiel does in Babylon what Jeremiah did back in Jerusalem. So if you can remember the whole story of Jeremiah, the way he was talking to the people about the reason for the exile coming was not in fact just bad luck, but their consistent rebellion against Yahweh, and God was being faithful to His promises. That's exactly what Ezekiel is doing over here in Babylon. Because believe it or not, the people who have been exiled over here still do not really get it. Wow, this is really bad news. This is really bad luck. And Ezekiel says, no. It's because of what you've done, right? And so you need to repent. So there's kind of the big idea of Ezekiel in a nutshell. And now what I want to share with you, the second thing, is simply this really important piece of the story where God Himself actually leaves the temple in Jerusalem. Now, the background to this, of course, is that Ezekiel has been deported before 586. Remember, I've given you these dates a couple times. Daniel was the first group to be deported in 605. Ezekiel leaves in 597, and all of this is before the temple has been destroyed. But while Ezekiel is actually in Babylon, he's transported in visions back to see what's going on over here in Jerusalem, and that's where we're going to pick up the story. And I have a number of maps to show you. I know this is a little bit difficult to see. Let me see if I can darken it up in here a little bit. I do this carefully, hoping you've had enough caffeine already this morning. And I know you can't see all the details here, but this is just the first of several maps I want to show you, because I want you to get a sense of the geography, topography, the map of Jerusalem. And here it is, a couple of features I want you to see just from this map. And the first is this, that in this area, I can get my cursor, in this area down in here, this is the original city of Jerusalem, or what we call the city of David. Kind of a narrow little peninsula. It's not as narrow as it looks on the map, of course, but relatively to the rest of the city, which is about the city walls during Jesus' time. This is a fairly narrow little section down in here. To the north of it, you find the temple courts really large, the size of 17 football fields up here. And the little black dot in here, kind of shaped like a T, is the temple proper itself. The front or the top of the T, which is pointed toward the east over here, is the temple and the altar. And over here is the Valley of Kidron, and over here is the Garden of Gethsemane, which obviously plays an important role in this season of the year and in our faith. So let me take you to the next picture, which is a little bit easier to see, a little bit more 3D. Now you're looking at it a little bit from the west. Notice back here was that city of David in this area here. And then again, the temple proper, sort of T-shaped, again facing to the east in the Kidron Valley out here. Now, again, part of what these maps do is make it look really, really tiny, but again, of course, it's all a matter of scale. So in order to demonstrate a little bit of scale, I want you to take a look at this teeny tiny little precarious walkway of stairs up here to the temple area. Notice as we zoom in here, this is what it looks like. Obviously, this thing is called, it's called Robinson's Arch because a guy named Robinson kind of discovered the thing and sort of the rubble which was left there. But you can see that it's a magnificent, majestic, huge limestone stairway. Again, a little bit of proportion with the people, not ants, traveling up here on the thing. So again, the Mount of Olives up in here, not exactly like a huge mountain, certainly not the Rockies or something like that. Really what we would think of as a big hill. But the Mount of Olives over here to the east, and it is headed from the south to the north. This is going to become important later on, just trust me. And again, the temple area up here. So what I'm going to do next is show you as though you were sitting right here on the Mount of Olives, looking back from the east to the west. So here you are up in the Mount of Olives looking back. This is now an actual model of the temple laid out in Jerusalem that's very helpful for us. Notice here the temple proper in the middle of it. Now you can see better this big rectangular area outlined here. It's about 17 football fields in size there, right? So it's a huge, huge area. The temple obviously looks rather small here, but it's probably 70 or 80 feet high. The same thing over here. Notice this big orange area. This is later called Solomon's Porch. He didn't really have anything to do with it, but that's what it's called, and this is where you would exchange money for animals. Of course, when Jesus goes in and chases out the money changers, this is probably the place where they were. To give you a sense of the scale, here's what this area actually looks like down below. It's a two-storied thing. And if you go inside the first story, it's just this beautiful, majestic wonder that is far larger than it has to be, but it's just sort of beautiful and supposed to overwhelm you and say, look, you're in God's presence here, right? This is not actually the temple proper, but it's a beautifully high, airy, majestic, luxurious area. So with that then, here is another picture of the whole area that I'm about to zoom in on. You can see the original city of David would have been here, the big, huge valley right here, the Mount of Olives here, the Garden of Gethsemane in here somewhere. And what I want to show you is the view today from that perspective. Obviously, the temple is not there. So if you were over on the west, looking to the east, here's what you would see. That very familiar Dome of the Rock. We talked about it before. The third most holy site in Islam. And it goes about 50 feet high. It's built exactly on the spot where the temple was for spiritual purposes, that is, so that the Jews can't build a temple. But the temple would have overtowered that and made that look like a small little thing. So as you look over the top of it, you're seeing the edge of the Mount of Olives on the east. Now, with that background then, let's zoom in here and let's go to the story of Ezekiel. Here we find ourselves in Ezekiel chapter 8, and he has this vision / transportation back to Jerusalem. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but some of it is mental, some of it is physical. I like the way it even begins here in chapter 8, verse 3. He stretched out what looked like a hand and took me by the hair of my head. The Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and in visions of God, he took me to Jerusalem. So we know a couple of things about Ezekiel here. Number one, he was not bald, at least before this incident took place. The Spirit of God just kind of picks him up in Babylon, carries him over to Jerusalem, at least in visions, to see what's going on. So we pick up the story. He takes me to the entrance to the north gate of the inner court. Let me show you where that is. This is the north is kind of to the top here of the picture. There is an outer court right here, and this is the inner court right in here, right? So it's a very specific spot where the Spirit of God takes him and shows him what is going on. To the entrance to the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood. So you say, okay, what kind of idol is this? Well, it doesn't really matter. The point is that the Jewish people have taken the idol of another god, put it inside God's house, which obviously provokes him to jealousy. To go back to the old Hosea-Gomer metaphor, right? Hosea comes home one day, another man is in the house, and the doors are locked. That's the kind of the situation here. So God comes back, Ezekiel sees this, and there before me was the glory of God of Israel, as in the vision I had seen in the plain. Now, again, the temple model, a little easier to see. That north gate would have been right in here where this temple, where this idol that provokes to jealousy is seen. So he said to me, the next verse, "Son of man, do you see what they're doing? The utterly detestable things the house of Israel is doing here, things that will drive me far from my sanctuary." So this kind of gives us a clue where the whole story is going. God is showing Ezekiel, look, I'm leaving my house. I'm not staying here anymore by the way they're behaving, and this is why I'm going to leave. So things that will drive me from my sanctuary, you will see things that are even more detestable. So I went in, and I looked, and I saw portrayed all over the walls all kinds of crawling things and detestable animals and the idols of the house of Israel. So they've scribbled graffiti over this. Remember that what is typically here are pictures of cherubim and palm trees and fruit, and it is supposed to remind one of the Garden of Eden, right, that you can't get into. And so what they have done is they've scribbled idols and all that sort of stuff over it. So here's where we go next. So God says, okay, because of this, I'm going to leave. Now the glory of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim. Now we haven't talked about where that is, but I trust that you know. This is way back in the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is, and the cherubim are there. And the presence of God, the Shekinah glory, goes up and starts to move. So it goes up from above the cherubim where it had been and moved to the threshold of the temple. So a very short little movement here first. From the Holy of Holies in the inner part of the temple out to the front of the temple to the threshold, and then stops. Right? Then we pick up a whole chapter later. Ezekiel chapter 10, then the glory of the Lord departed from over the threshold of the temple and stopped at the entrance to the east gate of the Lord's house. So moves again and then stops again at the eastern gate. So on his way out, but not just this immediate abandonment, but rather this kind of slow way he moves away to kind of cherish and reluctant sort of leaving, right? The way you would leave someone you don't want to leave, right? You know you have to go, but you kind of stop, and then you look back, and then you stop, and then you look back, and then you wave again, and you don't really want to go, but you have to go. And that's exactly the kind of scene we're kind of getting here, where God is slowly leaving. Then, finally, in chapter 11, now we moved on another chapter. The cherubim with the wheels beside them spread their wings. The glory of the Lord of Israel was above them, and the glory of the Lord went up from within the city and stopped above the mountain east of it, which is the Mount of Olives. So it goes down the Kidron Valley and then goes to the Mount of Olives and then ascends to heaven. So here we have the exit of God from the temple where he had been for, 1,000 years or so. Goes to the Mount of Olives, goes up north, and so the trouble, of course, one of the main troubles, as we've discussed before, with Zerubbabel's little temple is not just that it's this squatty little hut in comparison to Solomon's grand Porsche, right? But God doesn't live there anymore. The lights are on, but nobody's home. It's like, wow, God really seems to have abandoned this place, and he hasn't come back, which is another reason why the return under Zerubbabel to rebuild the temple out of all the rubble is kind of, in some senses, sort of a physical success, but not very much of a spiritual or emotional success, because God hasn't come back. Right? So God never does come back throughout this entire period between the Testaments until here. And he comes back in Luke chapter 19, not in the form of the Spirit, but in the form of the Son. And the story goes like this. As he approached Bethpage and Bethany at the hill called the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, which no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here." So Jesus begins the triumphal entry riding on this little colt at the Mount of Olives. And I don't know if this is starting to ring some bells or you're able to connect the dots here a little bit, but all sorts of history is converging here at this point in time and in geography here. In the very same way that the first son of David, Solomon, rode a little animal down to be coronated, so Jesus does as well. But even more importantly, Jesus picks up that spot where God the Spirit left before and follows the same path, right? So he traces the same path down and up into the temple. Now, if you have eyes to see, eyes of faith, you recognize, wow, God went away in 592 BC, but now God has come back starting there in the Mount of Olives, and traces the steps down, and here he is again, right? And so this is a conditional offer. Will you have me? Will you have this man reign over you? And of course, the people say, no, we'd rather crucify him eventually, right? So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us here. Fast forward 50 days, Acts chapter 1, verse 11. This is where Jesus is standing, again, on the Mount of Olives. And this is, of course, where he says, I want you to be witnesses in all the world, and then he ascends into heaven. And at this point, the disciples have said, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus doesn't answer the question. He just starts going up, right? And so that's where we pick up the scene here in Acts chapter 1. The angel says, men of Galilee, why do you stand here looking into the sky? And they say, well, because he never answered the question. Are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? He just laughed and said, be my witnesses, right? And the angel says, this same Jesus who's been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you have seen him go into heaven. So he goes up in bodily form into heaven, and he's going to come back the same way. Now, the angel doesn't say he's going to come back to the same place, but if you take a look at the book of Zechariah, which we will do, it says, on that day, talking about his second coming, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two, and he will come back down and go into his temple and take possession of it all. And so finally, over this incredible span of 592 to Jesus' first coming to the second coming, right, you kind of get the sense here that God has this well-worn path down the Kidron Valley, up to the Mount of Olives, and then up into heaven and comes back down. It's like the divine heliport, right, where God comes and goes from. And so you see this pattern developing. And so my guess is that when Jesus does come down and he goes down the valley of Kidron and up to the eastern gate, here's what he will find. This eastern gate has been closed up. It's been blocked in. Why? Well, because a lot of people know these prophecies. And there are a lot of people who know the prophecies who don't want them to happen. And so a number of people, I won't say who, but a number of people who don't want this Messiah to come back have put a little cemetery right there in front of the gate, thinking that no holy man would want to touch, such unclean things. And then, of course, they've walled up the gate. So, second coming happens. Jesus says, oh my goodness, I was going to walk through the gate, but now I can't because there are blocks there. I don't know what I'm going to do. I have to call off the second coming. Unless, of course, he just decides to walk through the walls, which, of course, he will be able to do. And, of course, the people in the tombs there are probably the happiest people around, because rather than contaminating him with uncleanness, he'll probably raise them to life. This is what Messiah does when he comes back, and walks right into the gate. Again, you can see the proximity. It's part of the reason I wanted you to see the whole geography. You see the proximity of the Dome of the Rock right behind it, right? So, I want to show you one more little deal here, more perspective, and that is, you see the little blue oval sitting on the western side of the Mount of Olives. You can imagine what the view looks like, right? It's a really beautiful view. You're looking over the valley into the city of Jerusalem from there. And what I want to show you is looking from that direction, from where the arrow is, right? So you're in the western side looking to the east on the Mount of Olives. Now, this next picture I want to show you, I'm kind of trying to set it up for you because it's not easy to see, but at nighttime it kind of looks like this. And you can see how the Mount of Olives there is a beautiful slope, and you see all sorts of little blocks over it. That little building at the top is I don't know if it's Mormon, I think it's a Mormon school. It's kind of sad to see here, but the rest of those little blocks, do you have any sense of what they are? Has anybody been to Jerusalem? Have you been by this area, or can you imagine what this is? You know what it is? Yeah, these are tombs, right? From the daytime, this is what they look like. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Schindler's List, story about the man who, the German guy, arms manufacturer, who, won't go into the whole story, but he ends up saving thousands and thousands of Jewish lives. And as it turns out, at the end of the movie, the actors and the actual people whom they represented, those who were still alive when they made the movie, walk by Schindler's grave, which is only about 600 yards from where this is. It looks just like one of these graves. And all the people who walk by carry a little stone and set it up on top of the grave as a memorial. It is, in their culture, what flowers would be to ours, right? But the rocks are probably cheaper and they last a lot longer. So what you see here are a whole bunch of rocks on top of tombs demonstrating people and loved ones who've come by and left their remembrances, say, here's Grandpa, right? And so what you've got here is an entire cemetery built on this spot. Why? Because it's prime real estate? Well, they're better places to be buried, but if you have eyes of faith, and you say, I believe that someday the mountain is going to be split and Messiah is going to come back, and I want a front row seat when it happens, this is the spot to be. And so many, many, many faithful people have decided this is where I'm going to be buried because I want to have a front row seat when the resurrection and the coming of Messiah occurs. Now, there's one more facet to this entire story I haven't told you about, but I hope it will make a little bit of sense to you now, and that is this. In Acts chapter 2, when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. And they saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. So this very sad story in 592, when the Spirit of God leaves and doesn't come back till Jesus comes back to the triumphal entry, but then of course they crucify him, and so he leaves again. He says, but it's okay, because I'm going to send you another comforter who then comes back, and now instead of a big pillar of fire on top of the temple of stone, there are little pillars of fire on the top of every temple of believers, who then, instead of being confined to Israel, are mobile temples who can go out into the rest of the world to, like Judea and Samaria and the ends of the earth, and carry the message everywhere. And so you have here kind of this closure, some sort of closure to the story of God's presence and God's witness and the way it's moving forward in the New Testament. So all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Of course, Paul picks up on the same language in 1 Corinthians. Do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, who is in you, whom you received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your body. And so when Paul says that, and Luke says that in Acts, he's kind of expecting you to bring everything with you from the story from Ezekiel and Zerubbabel and all that background together to recognize where you sit in the story of God and the plan of God and what your responsibility is. God has not localized himself to one spot because now the message is to go out. There is a mission. There's not just a blessing of the Spirit with you, but a mission that goes with it. We're obligated to go. Right? So I think that's all I want to tell you about the story of Ezekiel, I think. So time to move on now to Haggai and Zechariah. All right, let's take a look at these guys. And here's what we're going to see. Preview of Haggai and Zechariah. We're going to take a look at why why those who returned from the exile found it hard to worship with all their hearts. You've already seen some insight into that so far, about there is no one home at the temple. Number two, we're going to show you a little chart, chronological chart, where Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah fit in relationship to the exile. Number three, who Haggai was talking about when he said, if you build it, he will come. You guys recognize the old pop culture reference here? Anybody watch Field of Dreams? If you don't know the old baseball movie, it totally escaped you. But long before Kevin Costner said it, Haggai said, if you build it, he will come. And then finally, why the word branch is a very good metaphor, a powerful metaphor for Messiah. And you'll also understand why several of the gospel writers call Jesus a branch. So let's get started here then with a little review. Now, typically I would be embarrassed by having told you this 4 times before, but I recognize what a challenge the final exam actually is, and I'm thinking, maybe a little review doesn't hurt at all. So this is probably the 3rd time or 4th time we've seen this. I hope it'll stick. Israel's a pale shadow of her former self after the exile, right? In those 4 measures. In terms of a king, we go from a king to we don't have a king. He just is a carpenter, eventually. From the temple, we go from this beautiful Solomonic porch to Zerubbabel's Geo-Metro. The high priest who has that breastplate called the Urim and Thummim, which is a hotline to heaven, they lose it over the exile. When they come back, the high priest is functioning, but he doesn't have it. We lost it. Bummer. And then finally, the worst one, Holy of Holies, is filled with the glory of God, and then of course it's empty because of what you just saw in Ezekiel. The Spirit of God does not come back. So let's talk about this exile, and you know the answers to a lot of these questions already. Why is an exile? Well, because of the rebellion of the people. Life during the exile, I'll just cover it really quickly, was good. In fact, so good because of Daniel being over in Babylon to help out those citizens there, that many of them didn't want to return when it was time to return. So the length of the exile is something we should talk about because if you've ever actually tried to do the math, it doesn't work, at least on the surface. But let me talk to you about the math here and say that the people were gone from Jerusalem or from Israel for over 70 years because, again, as I mentioned, Daniel was in the first deportation from the land in 605. Then when they do return under Zerubbabel in 536, that's 70 years the people were gone, or at least a span of time, 70 years. And then the temple itself is destroyed in 586, but again, they're only 50 years from 586 to 536. But that's part of what Haggai and Zechariah are about. They're all about the rebuilding of the temple, and that temple isn't finished until 516. So there you can see the math is pretty easy, 70 years. So we talk about the exile being 70 years. The people are gone 70, the temple's gone 70. They just don't, they overlap, but they're not the exact same 70, but that's where the numbers come from. So let me talk to you about a really crazy, wild, and hairy chart. I say that because as you look at this chart and you're thinking about it next Thursday night at about 4 a.m., not that any of you would do that, but you know, just some people might. You're going to look at that and you're going to hate me and think, how much does Z want us to know? And so I'll tell you, I'll make it easy. There are 3 things I want you to know from this chart. Right? The first thing I want you to know is this. You see the exile on the left, and the beginning, or the end of the exile here is 536. In 536, we return to the land and the exile is over. That means this entire chart is in the post-exile, right? That's all I want you to know. All of it is post-exile. So that means that Haggai and Zechariah and Esther and Chronicles and Malachi, all of this stuff that you see up here in the chart is happening after the return to the land. Right? Point number 1. Point number 2 has to do with Haggai and Zechariah. And if I draw a little line from Haggai and Zechariah down to the date, you see that they begin to minister in 520. That's an important date because Haggai makes a big deal about it. In fact, 4 times in the first couple of chapters, he dates his sermons so specifically you can tell exactly what month and day they were. Like on September 27th, 520 BC, this happened. And then I told the next sermon on October 12th, 520, and then it was November 520, right? It goes right down there. And here's why. The first thing that happens when Zerubbabel comes back is he says, hey, look at all this rubble, let's rebuild a temple out of it. And so he does right here. Do you see that? That little tiny green dot right there, that little green dot back in 536. And the reason why it's so tiny is because he starts to rebuild, and then as soon as he does, the people who were in the land before them, non-Israelites, say, oh, we don't want you guys building a temple. You guys get all patriotic and get all whipped up and get all spiritual and start to do crazy things. We don't want that. So what they do is they stop it for the next 15 years. You see this, right? So a little bit of green for go 1 year, stop for 15, get it? Red, green, go, stop. This is when Haggai and Zechariah come along in 520 and say, come on, people, let's get our act together. We got this temple to rebuild for God. Let's work together. And so Haggai and Zechariah come along in a team ministry for the sole purpose of getting the temple rebuilt, and it takes them 4 years until 516 go, and they've got it done. Okay, you got it? Want me to say it again, or have you got it? You got it. Okay, so in 536 then it stops, then they get it going for 4 years, and it's finished in 516. That's the second thing I want you to know. Third thing I want you to know is this. I want you to look at the chart and see the name Ezra. I want you to know why it's Ezra, okay? It's Ezra because Ezra actually lives during his, I was just thinking that's a dumb way to say it. Ezra lives during his lifetime, like most people do. Ezra's lifetime is right here during the part. But the part of his book that he starts with is way back here. It's about the rebuilding of the temple under Zerubbabel. Now, there are 80 years. There's an 80-year gap between chapter 6 and chapter 7. And everybody knows that. He's not trying to fool anybody. He wants to talk about his day, chapters 7 to 10, and he does that by prefacing the work of God 80 years in the past as a really perfect preface for what he wants to say. So he's kind of like going back to the Civil War and telling the Civil War story and then talking about today. This is what happened before that leads up to where we are now, right? So that's the third thing to help understand the story of Ezra. So number one, all this is post-exile. Number two, chronology of Haggai and Zechariah. Number three, Ezra. Right? So let's get in then to the introduction to these two, Haggai and Zechariah. These two guys are kind of like a good cop, bad cop if you understand the reference. Right? The reference is to a team that works together. One guy is the mean one, the other guy is the sweet one, just in case you don't know exactly which motivation is going to work with your average perpetrator, right? So one guy will be nice, one guy will be mean. It's not like one's mean and one's nice here, but they have very different styles. Very different styles, but they are very singular in purpose. What they want to see is the temple reconstruction completed. Now, I don't know if you've ever had a building project at your church and pastor went back and preached some sermons from here or from Nehemiah, building the temple, but this is a whole lot more than building an extra youth center at a church, right? This is building the place where God's presence is supposed to be and where sacrifice and atonement occur. So this is a really, really big deal to see this thing rebuilt, and so their ministries are spent doing that. So in this team ministry, one is direct, the other is indirect. One is very practical. One speaks about visions in the future, like, if you build this, he's going to come. One is very immediate about needs that are happening right now. One is very ultimate, thinking about the future. One is specific, one is general. And I don't know if you can categorize these two by reading the books, but as it turns out, you know who is who here? Who's the detailed, practical, immediate person? This is actually Haggai. Zechariah is the guy who's known for these 8 night visions. So a very typical way Haggai speaks is, hey, you guys don't have the temple built. Hey, you're working on your own houses. You should be working on a temple. Hey, go up into the mountain and take your axe and cut down a tree and then bring it back and build a temple. I don't understand. No, you got to understand that, right? Now, Zechariah is going to give us all these night visions, and you say, what does that mean? But Haggai, there's no trouble. He's very direct and detailed. Says, go build a temple now. Right? So, with all apologies to Haggai, I'm now going to skip and go to Zechariah. So, when we get to heaven, and you see Ezekiel, let me know. I'm going to hide. When you see Haggai, let me know. I got to get out of there because he's going to be upset. We just skipped over his good book. But Zechariah's night visions are kind of hard to miss. So let's take a look at them, right? He has these 8 night visions, all of which are intended to encourage and change the hearts of the people who are so discouraged they don't see the benefit in building the temple. And if you've ever been in any kind of leadership situation, you understand what this can be like. It's not so much that the people can't do a job, it's that they don't want to do the job. That they don't see the need, they don't see the importance, and so what they need is inspiration, they need encouragement. And Zechariah has these visions which are meant to wake people up and say, oh, so if Messiah is going to come to this temple, then maybe we should build it. This is cool. He has these visions in one night, has way too much pizza. And the first one is about horses and riders, and God will avenge. Now remember, his whole goal, along with Haggai, is to get the temple rebuilt. So here's the way it goes. During the night I had a vision, and there before me was a man riding a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in a ravine. Behind him were red, brown, and white horses. And they reported, we've gone throughout the earth and found the whole world at rest and in peace. Now, at that point, you stop and think, well, that's good, right? I mean, this is every beauty queen's goal, world peace. So it seems like a real positive thing. But the answer is no, it's a terrible thing. Why? Well, let me tell you one of my summertime stories, not a favorite one, but a vivid one. My cousin lived next door to us. He was 4 years older than I was. Kim's favorite pastime in the summer was to get me down, wrestle me down, put me on my back, sit on top of my belly, and I would lay on the ground like this, and he'd put his knees up on my elbows, right? And then he could just have his way. He could do anything he wanted to. And his favorite thing to do was to pluck some grass and then just kind of tickle my nose, shove it up my nose. That's what we did all the time, right? So one day, while he's got me down, and I'm just, as uncomfortable as can be, my mom hears what's going on or something, and so she's in the kitchen inside. We hear her say out through the screen window, hey, is everything all right out there? And I thought, oh man, this is my chance. I start to yell out, right? And as soon as I do, my cousin takes his hand and is everything okay out there? And I'm saying, my cousin said, oh yeah, we're fine. I'm thinking, yeah, he's at peace. He's having a good time. I'm not having a good time, right? And that's exactly what was going on here. Israel is not having a good time after the post-exile. They're flat on their backs. The Gentiles are sitting on top of them, lording it over, and everybody's saying, oh yeah, we're at peace. And God looks at this, and the prophet looks at this and says, yeah, they are, but we're not. And so this encouragement then is this. God says, I am very angry with the nations that feel secure, feel in peace. I was only a little angry with Israel, right? But they added to the calamity. That is, they overdid the exile. That is, the nations did. Therefore, this is what the Lord says, I'll return to Jerusalem with mercy, and there my house will be rebuilt, and the measuring line will be stretched out over Jerusalem, declares the Lord, because I will come back and I will rebuild this place, and it will be alive someday, right? So the very first vision, again, very visionary, very conceptual, but encouraging that God is going to work here. Now, let me fast forward to the middle one. This is probably one that you may have heard about, but maybe you didn't know the context of it. And here is the strange dream. He asked me, what do you see? I answered, I see a solid gold lampstand with a bowl at the top and 7 lights on it. Think of a Jewish menorah, okay? With 7 channels to the lights. Also, there were 2 olive trees by it, one on the right of the bowl and the other on its left. You think, what in the world is going on? Well, it looks like this. You got these 2 trees, 2 olive trees, and you've got these pipes coming out of the trees, and they're going to this menorah. Now, does this make any sense to you at all? Can you figure out what the picture is here? Remember that this is ancient Israel. We light our menorah not with wax candles, but with oil. Laura? Exactly right? The trees are the fuel for this. So you got the olive oil flowing through the pipes into the menorah. So theoretically speaking, it's sort of cartoonish, but theoretically speaking, how long is the light going to stay on? It's going to go forever, right? And so what the interpretation is, look, this guy over here on the left, this is Joshua, the high priest. And the guy on the right is Zerubbabel, the royal leader, right? Going all the way back to the very first day. And God raised up 2 leaders. The first one was priestly. His name was Joshua. The second was royal. His name was. These are the guys right here, okay? And so God says, look, I'm going to work by my Spirit through Joshua and Zerubbabel to reestablish a lighthouse for my name right here in Jerusalem. And so the words, so he said to me, this is the word of the Lord to Zerubbabel, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit. You guys heard that verse before? This is where it comes from. And it has to do not with the mission trip, although that is not a bad application, but what it has to do with originally is the rebuilding of the temple. What are you, O mighty mountain? Before Zerubbabel, you'll become level ground. I don't care what the obstacle is, God's going to level it out. Then he will bring out the capstone, the final piece that fits in the temple, to shouts of God bless it, right? So the people who are around saying, wow, if God is for us, who can be against us? Let's get this thing rebuilt, right? And so by 516 they do. Now, those are the only 2 visions out of the 8 I want to share with you. But I do want to share with you one more story, which is the 9th story. It's not a vision, but it is the concluding jewel, kind of crown jewel here, sort of a pun, of Joshua the high priest. Now, before I talk about it, let me just say something about the title. The title, if you were, well, you are an intelligent crowd, I don't want to say that. If you were a Jewish crowd and thinking Jewishly, if you saw this title, what would you think of it? The crowning of Joshua the high priest. Would that bother you? Would you think it's okay? Is it normal? Is it everyday event? Okay thing to do? Answer, terrible thing to do. You can't do that. Crowns fit on kings, not on high priests. You can't mix those 2 together. One's from the tribe of Levi, the other's from the tribe of Judah. This is wrong, right? And so God says, yeah, I know, but watch this object lesson. This is going to blow your mind, right? So here's the way the story goes. Take the silver and gold and make a crown and set it on the head of the high priest, Joshua, son of Jehozadak. Why? Well, watch. Tell him, this is what the Lord Almighty says, here's the man whose name is the branch. You say, well, that totally clears it up. I got it now. So let's talk about what this symbol means too. Then we'll come back and put it together. When you go back into the prophets, particularly Isaiah and Jeremiah, they start to develop this theology around this person called the branch. In that day, talking about Messianic times, the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious. Now, it doesn't tell you very much, except it's going to be great. But then we get more insight in Isaiah chapter 11, which says, a shoot, or branch, will come up from the stump of Jesse. So whenever you see Jesse, you know we're talking about King David, right? So if we're using the metaphor of a tree, Jesse is the root, and all of David and his sons are the trunk and the leaves of the tree. Now, what we're going to see here is a message that we've seen before in other metaphors. Remember the time in the book of Amos where we had that tent of David? Remember the booth of David, the house of David, and the tent fell down? Right? We had one that was up and then one fell down. Remember that? That was great, wasn't it, April? Huh? Yeah, the tent fell down. And then we said someday God's going to raise up David's fallen tent. Well, same message here. So when you get a stump of Jesse, it means there's a branch that's going to come up from it. So it says, from his roots a branch will bear fruit. You got to put my terrible graphical abilities on display. Jehoiachin, last Davidic king before the exile. We know that name. Then we cut the kings off in the exile. This means there are no kings from 586 till now. And then we have another stump, and here's the thing. When you cut off a tree like this, you've seen somebody else cut off a tree like this in the fall, what happens in the springtime? I'm embarrassed to show you, but you know the answer. A little branch, see? Let's cover that up because it's so ugly. But a branch comes up where you wouldn't expect it, right? And the point here is that the branch is going to be that king who sits on the throne who comes from Jesse's stump. So, Jeremiah picks up on it too. Days are coming, declares the Lord, I will raise up to David a righteous branch, a good king, a king who will reign wisely, do what is just and right in the land. In those days and at that time, I'll make a righteous branch sprout from David's line, who'll do what is just and right in the land. So we are used in Isaiah and Jeremiah to having this figure of a branch symbolizing the Messianic king. But now look what Zechariah does with it. Tell him, we're back in Zechariah chapter 6 now, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Here's the man, this guy who's a priest, whose name is the branch. And so what he's saying is this. He'll branch out from this place and build the temple of the Lord. He'll be clothed with majesty, will sit and rule on his throne, and he will be a priest on his throne too. So just like Psalm 110, Zechariah is saying, if you build this temple, guess who's going to come to it? The one who's going to come to it is the Davidic king, who is also going to be a priest all together in one person. Now this is all the more fascinating when you realize this temple just gets built. Zerubbabel is the one who rebuilds it. Zerubbabel is the son of David. Everybody wants Zerubbabel to sit on it as the son of David who has built the temple. But we all know that what this is pointing to is somebody better than Zerubbabel, who's also going to be a priest, who's going to offer a sacrifice of his own body. And so the plot just thickens and thickens and thickens, looking forward to the day when, in fact, on Calvary, the priest offers up his own body and can come back to rule. And who in the world saw that coming? And yet you see it right here in Zechariah and Psalm 110 as well. Someday we're going to have a priest who is from the line, his own line, and from the line of David the king, and he's going to put them, the two of them together. And so we've got the king and priest put together in one, and there will be harmony between the two offices of king and priest. And so, if you think God has given up and you're tired of building a temple, think about this, and maybe you should put your hands back to the plow and get the job done.